Hello, and welcome back to another session of Reformed Thinking. We are really glad you were joining us today as we open up the archives of church history to see what the giants of the faith have to teach us about Scripture. Today is a session I have been, I have been really looking forward to this one.
Oh, me too. Absolutely.
Because we are putting a truly special text on the table. We're doing a deep dive into one of those famous verses in the entire New Testament. I'm talking about John 14.2, where Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many mansions."
Yeah, and it is a verse that is, it is often read at funerals, and for very good reason. It offers such a solid sense of hope and stability when everything else in your life feels like it is falling apart.
Right.
But today, we are going to look at it through the specific, and I would say microscopic lens of Jonathan Edwards.
Which is going to be fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Because most people know Edwards for Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
That is the one everyone reads in high school literature class.
Spot on. And because of that, they assume he only preached about fire and brimstone. But this sermon, which is titled simply Many Mansions, it shows us a totally different side of his theology.
It does, although being Edwards, he certainly brings a weightiness to it, a gravitas that we might miss if we just read the verse casually on a greeting card or a coffee mug.
That is what I love about digging into these old sermons. You think you know a verse. I mean, it has been cross-stitched on pillows for generations.
Yeah, the classic needlepoint verse.
Right. And then someone like Edwards comes along and shows you that you have only been skating on the surface. Before we get into the specifics of the mansions, let's set the scene. As we always do here on Reformed Thinking, we want to look at this through our specific theological lens. We are holding to the Protestant Reformed tradition, adhering to the Westminster Confession. So, with that framework, where do we find ourselves in the biblical narrative when Jesus speaks these words?
Well, we are situated right in the upper room. This
Yeah.
is the Last Supper discourse. You find it spanning John 13 and 14. And the context here is incredibly heavy. You really have to strip away our modern knowledge of the ending.
The resurrection and all that.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to forget, the ending and just sit in the tension of that specific moment. Jesus has just told his disciples in John 13.33 that he is going away. And here is the kicker. Where he is going, they cannot come.
Which is devastating.
Completely. You have to imagine the atmosphere in that room. These men, they have given up everything to follow him. They left their fishing nets, their tax booths, their families. For 3 solid years, their entire identity has been wrapped up in being physically present with Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
And now he says he is leaving.
It must have been crushing. Edwards points out that they were surprised and sorrowful. They did not understand the plan yet. They did not have the full picture of the cross, the atonement, the resurrection. They just heard goodbye.
Goodbye, and you cannot follow me. It sounds almost like a breakup.
It really does. And we see that confusion manifesting specifically in Peter. In the previous chapter, Peter, who is always the one to speak first.
Always putting his foot in his mouth.
Always. He asks, "Lord, whither goest thou?" He wants to know the destination. And when Jesus tells him he cannot follow now, Peter gets visibly frustrated. He asks, "Why cannot I follow thee now? I will lay down my life for thy sake."
Peter is desperate to maintain that physical proximity to Christ. He equates safety and discipleship with just being in the exact same room as the Master.
So Christ's objective here isn't just to give a theology lecture on the architecture of the afterlife. He isn't pulling out celestial blueprints just for the sake of information.
No, he is doing pastoral care. He is comforting them.
And that is really the mission of this text, and honestly the mission of our discussion today. We want to understand what Edwards meant by mansions, what the structure of heaven actually is, and, because this is Edwards, of course, the frightening reality of the alternative if one does not have a mansion.
Edwards argues that Christ is telling them, essentially, I am going home to my Father's house, and the reason I am going is to make sure there is room for you. It is a complete reorientation of their grief into hope.
Let's start with that first big idea Edwards puts forward. He breaks the text down into distinct propositions. The first is about the nature of heaven itself. He says, heaven is God's house. Now that sounds simple, almost like a Sunday school answer.
It does sound basic at first glance.
But Edwards seems to think there's a lot more to that phrase than we usually consider.
He defines it very concretely. And this is crucial because we often drift into this vague, ethereal idea of heaven, like it is just a state of mind or floating on clouds, playing harps. Edwards says no, it is a place, it is a structure. And he uses strong biblical typology to make this point.
Right. He looks at the Old Testament.
Yes, specifically the Temple of Solomon. The temple was built to be God's house on earth, but Edwards argues it was really just a shadow, a model of the true reality in heaven.
He mentions the Holy of Holies. In the earthly temple, that was the inner sanctum, where the Ark of the Covenant sat, representing God's throne. And only the high priest could go there.
Precisely. And Edwards connects this to the structure of the universe itself. He cites Amos 9.6, which talks about God building his stories in the heaven.
Like architectural stories, floors of a building.
Yes, it is the image of a great building with multiple levels. While the entire universe belongs to God and the earth is given to the sons of men, the highest heaven, what the Apostle Paul calls the third heaven, is reserved specifically as God's own abode. It is the location of his immediate presence. It is the reality that the earthly temple merely copied.
He uses 3 specific metaphors to describe this house, and I think unpacking each one helps us get a much better picture of what Edwards is driving at. The first one you mentioned is the temple.
Yes. Heaven is a temple because it is primarily the place of worship. On earth, we have houses of worship, we call them churches, where we gather on the Lord's Day. Edwards calls these earthly assemblies the outworks or the gates of heaven.
The outer courts, essentially.
Right. But in the actual heaven, there is a glorious assembly, the Church of the Firstborn, constantly worshiping. It is the place where the liturgy never ends. The primary activity is doxology, praising God.
The second metaphor he uses is the palace. This shifts the focus from worship to authority.
It does. A temple is for a deity, but a palace is for a king. Edwards brings to mind that God is the great king of the universe. Heaven is where he keeps his court.
So it is the seat of government.
Absolutely. Just as an earthly monarch has nobles and attendants, God has angels and archangels attending to him. The throne is there. It is the command center for all of creation. This adds a serious layer of majesty to the house. It is not just a place to sleep. It is a place of absolute sovereign rule.
Which fits perfectly with our reformed understanding of God's sovereignty over all things. And the third metaphor, which I actually find the most comforting of the 3, is the family home.
This is the one that really gets to the heart of Jesus' words in John 14, "In my Father's house." God is the householder. He is the Father. And the implication Edwards draws from Ephesians 2.1 is just beautiful. He says that believers on earth are currently abroad.
We are traveling.
We are not at home.
That is a massive shift in perspective, because we tend to think of Earth as home and heaven as a trip we take later, a destination. Edwards is saying, no, if you are a Christian, you are currently staying in a hotel in a foreign country. Home is where the Father is.
And in that home, the Father keeps his table. That is the exact phrase Edwards uses. It is where the family gathers for the feast. He references Luke 22, where Christ speaks of eating and drinking at his table in his kingdom.
So heaven is a temple for worship, a palace for ruling, and a home for fellowship.
It synthesizes all those deep longings we have. The longing for awe, the longing for order, and the longing for intimacy, all met in this one concept of God's house.
This leads us naturally to the second proposition Edwards raises, which zeroes in on the specific phrase, many mansions. I think for modern listeners, you hear the word mansion and it summons up images of Beverly Hills, a massive estate with a swimming pool and a 10-car garage. Is that what Edwards has in mind?
Not quite. It is helpful to look at the etymology there. The word Edwards is working with, and the word in the Greek texmonai really means abiding places or places of stay. It implies permanence.
So less about square footage and more about stability.
Right. Edwards clarifies that this is largely figurative language. We shouldn't necessarily think of literal drywall and shingles up in the clouds, but the physical imagery teaches us crucial spiritual truths. And the first truth Edwards draws out is about capacity.
He is actually very optimistic here regarding the numbers, isn't he?
He is incredibly optimistic. He argues that there is room for a vast multitude. He contrasts this with earthly churches. You and I have probably been to a popular church service where you have to squeeze into the back row, or maybe even go to an overflow room and watch on a screen.
Oh, definitely. Earthly meeting houses become, as he says, scanty or cramped.
But Edwards says heaven is never like that. There is always room.
I love how he phrases the theological reasoning for that. He says there is mercy enough in God and merit enough in Christ for millions of millions.
That is a classic Reformed distinction right there.
Hmm.
The capacity of heaven isn't based on the physical dimensions of the spiritual realm. It is based entirely on the sufficiency of Christ's atonement.
Because Christ's merit is infinite?
Yes, because his merit is infinite, the space he purchases is sufficient for all who believe. Edwards says the fountain of happiness is enough to fill everyone. No one will get there and find the cupboards bare. The many in many mansions is a direct witness to the infinite value of the cross.
The second key teaching under this many mansions idea is the diversity of accommodations. This was a point I found really touching in his sermon. He contrasts Christ with the disciples.
It is a stark contrast when you think about it. You have Jesus, the glorious, holy, sinless Son of God, and then you have the disciples. Edwards calls them poor, sinful, corrupt men.
Which is pretty accurate if you read the Gospels.
It is, and yet Jesus says there is room for him and for them in the exact same house. It flies in the face of human logic. Usually kings do not live with peasants.
The argument is essentially, if there is room for the sinless master, surely there is room for the redeemed servant.
Spot on. Edwards expands this to say that heaven suits all sorts of persons. It is not just for the spiritual giants, the Apostle Pauls and the John Calvins. There are accommodations for the great and the small.
For the rich and the poor.
Yes. For those who were great sinners but repented, and for those who lived relatively moral lives. For the babes in Christ, maybe those who came to faith on their deathbed, and for the strong saints who served God faithfully for decades.
He uses the palace analogy again here, doesn't he?
He does. A king's palace has a grand suite for the king and the heir, of course, but it also has rooms for the numerous household attendants. The fact that the king lives there doesn't mean the servants are left out in the cold.
It connects back to that idea of the infinite sufficiency of Christ. If you come to Christ, your background or your social status on earth does not disqualify you from a place in the Father's house. The mansion is tailored to the recipient of grace, not the earner of merit.
Which is such a comforting, grace-centered view.
Now, we are discussing Edwards, and we are coming at this from a Reformed perspective, so we absolutely cannot skip the third key teaching he brings up here, which is predestination. He claims the house was built with a specific number of people in mind.
He does. And he grounds this in Scripture. He references Matthew 25:34, where Jesus says, "Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Edwards argues that when God created the heavens in the beginning, he already had the complete roster of the elect.
He knew exactly who he designed to save.
This is high Reformed theology, straight out of the Westminster Confession, the decrees of God. The blueprint of heaven wasn't a generic, let's build a big building and see who decides to show up. It was a custom build.
So the architecture of heaven matches the census of the elect perfectly.
That is it. It isn't a situation where God saves a bunch of people and then suddenly has to scramble to build an extension on the house to fit them all.
No, adding a sunroom at the last minute.
Right. The house was built exceedingly great because God intended to save a great multitude which no man could number, as we read in Revelation 7. The preparation precedes the population.
This offers tremendous security for the believer. If the place was prepared for you from the foundation of the world, your arrival is expected. You aren't crashing the party. Your room has your name on it.
It shifts salvation from being a fragile human decision to a secure divine decree.
That moves us into the third section of our discussion today. And this is where the mansions concept gets a bit more granular and, honestly, perhaps a bit more controversial for modern ears. Edwards argues for a hierarchy of glory. He suggests that the phrase many mansions actually implies seats of various dignity.
This is a concept that often trips people up today. Because in our culture, we tend to think of heaven as a place of absolute flat equality, where everyone is exactly the same. Same status, same reward, same everything.
A kind of spiritual communism.
Yes, but Edwards, looking closely at Scripture, argues for degrees of glory. He says not everyone has the same status in heaven. Now, we need to be clear here. He isn't saying some people are sad and some are happy.
Right, there's no jealousy or envy in heaven.
Not at all. Everyone is perfectly happy. But the capacity for glory differs. Think of it like different sized cups, a pint glass and a shot glass. If both are submerged in the ocean, both are completely full. But the pint glass holds more water.
That is a great analogy. He supports this hierarchy idea with Matthew 20.23, doesn't he?
Yes.
Where Jesus is talking to the mother of James and John.
Yes, the sons of Zebedee. Jesus says that sitting at his right or left hand is prepared for specific people. It is not just open seating. And Edwards goes back to the palace analogy to make sense of this.
How does that work?
Well, every part of a palace is magnificent. If you are anywhere inside the king's palace, you are doing well. You are safe, you are fed, you are highly honored. But there is the king's presence chamber. That is the absolute highest honor.
The inner circle.
Right. Then there are the apartments for the heir. Then you have quarters for the high steward. And then rooms for the meaner officers or the lower servants. Everyone is in the palace. Everyone is part of the household. But the proximity to the king varies.
He also brings back the temple analogy here, which is very helpful visually if you know your Old Testament layout.
The temple was literally designed in zones of closeness to the presence of God. You had the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go, and only once a year. Then you had the holy place for the regular priests, then the inner court for the Levites, the court of Israel for the general population, and finally the court of the Gentiles on the perimeter.
And Edwards suggests heaven has a similar spiritual geography.
He does. Not that there are physical walls keeping people out, but that there are degrees of spiritual intimacy and honor. Some are given a closer proximity to the throne.
He even compares it to the church on earth, which is fascinating. In Edwards' day, and really until quite recently in church history, where you sat in church was a public sign of your social standing.
Oh, absolutely. The pew system.
Right.
You had the high seats and the inferior seats. People paid pew rents.
Right. And Edwards uses that cultural reality to explain the spiritual reality. He clarifies, though, that he isn't necessarily talking about physical location in heaven, like some people are stuck sitting in the back row and cannot hear the angelic choir very well.
No, it is about spiritual degrees of honor and glory. Some are nearer the throne in terms of their capacity to behold God and their role in his kingdom.
He mentions briefly that this might relate to different employments.
Yes. Just as the physical body has an eye and an ear, heaven might have different functions for different saints. We don't know all the specifics, obviously. But Edwards is firm that there is an order and a structure. It is not a chaotic mob. It is a kingdom. And a kingdom, by definition, has hierarchy.
But unlike earthly hierarchies, which are based on power and exploitation and greed, this heavenly hierarchy is based entirely on holiness and the capacity to reflect God's glory.
Which means everyone rejoices in the hierarchy. The person in the lower seat rejoices at the glory of the person in the higher seat.
Now, up to this point, Edwards has been painting a very glorious, uplifting picture. But in typical Puritan fashion, he pivots. We reach the application section of the sermon, or what the Puritans call the improvement.
The uses of the doctrine.
Right, and he starts by encouraging the anxious, which is lovely.
He wants to reassure the sinner who hears all this and thinks, I am too bad, there is no place for me in a holy palace. He reiterates that if you come to Christ, he will prepare a place for you.
The vastness of the mansions guarantees that physical space isn't the issue.
The issue is simply coming to Christ. He leaves no room for the objection that I am too far gone.
But then he drops the hammer. He moves to the warning of mortality. And this is where the sermon becomes very real, very historical, and honestly, almost jarring.
It really is. He talks about the absolute transience of our earthly dwellings. He calls our physical bodies houses of clay. And he uses a fascinating, obscure biblical phrase, lodges in a garden of cucumbers.
A lodge in a garden of cucumbers. That is not an image we use very often today. I don't think I have ever heard a preacher use that in a modern pulpit.
No, but for his agrarian audience in 18th century New England, it was vivid. A lodge in a cucumber patch was a temporary, flimsy shack put up just for the harvest season to watch over the crops.
Like a lean-to.
Basically. It was flimsy, drafty, and meant to be torn down the second the season was over. It is not a fortress. Edward says that is what our life on earth is. We spend all this time decorating our mansion on earth, painting the walls, getting new furniture, but it is really just a wobbly shack in a vegetable patch.
Wow. And he doesn't just leave it as a poetic metaphor. He references a specific event that had just happened in his congregation in Northampton. The part of the text genuinely gives me chills.
It is a striking pastoral moment. He talks about a father and a son who died within 2 weeks of each other. They lived in the same house. The son died first, in the flower of his days, as Edwards puts it, young, vibrant.
And then the father.
The father, who appeared totally healthy, died just a few days later. Edwards looks out at his congregation and says, essentially, look at that empty house down the street. Their earthly house knows them no more. It was a visceral, real-time reminder to his flock that death does not care about your plans, your age, or your health.
And he twists the knife a little bit regarding the actual building they're sitting in. Apparently, the Northampton congregation had just built a new meeting house.
Yes, they had a brand new church building. And you can imagine the people were incredibly proud of it. They were admiring the ornaments, as Edwards points out. They were happy with their new, comfortable pews.
And Edwards points out that these two men, the father and the son, had only met in this new building a few times.
They barely got to warm the seats before they were snatched away into eternity.
The lesson being, do not get attached to your seat in the earthly church.
That is it. You might be pleased with your pew, you might like the fine architecture, but you might not occupy it very long. It is sheer vanity to focus on your place in the earthly assembly if you haven't secured your place in the heavenly one.
This leads to the most terrifying part of the sermon, the binary fate. Edwards is crystal clear that there is no middle place, no purgatory, no limbo.
This is a core tenet of his theology in our Reformed faith. You either have a mansion in God's house or you have a habitation with devils. He describes the alternative with very visceral language: filthiness, abomination, outer darkness.
But the most specific warning is what we might call the churchgoer's hell.
This is a concept that should wake up anyone sitting comfortably in a pew.
The idea that sitting in church can actually make hell worse for you.
In a sense, yes. Edwards argues that those who had a seat in God's house on earth, meaning they were regular attenders, maybe even respected, baptized members of the visible church, but die unconverted, they face a specific misery. They are cast down from the very gate of heaven.
That is a haunting image, to be right at the gate, to be inside the earthly sanctuary, hearing the hymns, listening to the sermons, and then to fall.
To have been so close, to have heard the gospel week in and week out, to have sat in the holy place on earth, and yet to miss Christ in your heart. Edwards suggests that fall is far greater. Having a high place in the earthly church results in a worse place in hell if true conversion is missing.
Because the rejection of light is greater. To whom much is given, much is required.
Absolutely. It strips away any false comfort we might feel just by being religious or showing up on Sunday.
It is a sobering thought. It forces you to evaluate why you are sitting in the pew. Is it for social standing in the community? Is it just habit? Or is it because you genuinely know the landlord of the heavenly house?
That is the defining question, and Edwards pivots from that severe warning to a call for what he describes as holy ambition. He actually encourages people to be ambitious, which is unusual for a Puritan, but he redirects that ambition.
He says it is foolish to seek high seats in the earthly meeting house. That is just the vanity and honor of men.
Right. Who cares if you're the head deacon or if you have the best seat in the synagogue, if it is just for a few short years? But, Edwards says, it is wise, it is highly rational, to seek a mansion of distinguished glory in heaven.
But wait, how does one obtain that? If entrance to heaven is by grace alone, through faith alone, how do we get these higher degrees of glory?
Entrance is indeed by grace alone. You cannot earn your way in. We stand on the imputed righteousness of Christ. But the Reformed tradition, and Edwards specifically here, acknowledges that God graciously rewards the good works of his saints. He references 2 Corinthians 9:6. He that soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully.
So the suggestion is that high degrees of glory are offered to encourage eminent holiness and good works here on earth.
Yes, we are saved by faith, but our capacity for enjoying God's glory in eternity might be enlarged by our obedience, our suffering, and our holiness here and now.
So it is not that we earn a better room by our own merit, but that a life of sanctification expands our soul's capacity to receive what God freely gives.
That is a fantastic way to put it. And Edwards appeals to the logic of eternity here to drive the point home.
The logic being that earthly honor is nothing but a bubble.
It vanishes in an instant. He
Yeah.
has this very graphic image. He says that the worms treat the rich carcass and the poor carcass exactly the same.
The grave is the great leveler.
The ultimate leveler. But heavenly honor is everlasting. Once a seat is allotted, whether it is near the throne or further back, it is held for all eternity.
His final argument is really a calculation of value. He asks, if people care so much about their pew assignment for a few hours a week, which historically was a real source of intense conflict in colonial churches.
People fought bitterly over who sat where.
Right. So he asks, if you care that much about a wooden bench for 2 hours on Sunday, how much more should you care about your eternal assignment?
It puts our priorities in sharp, undeniable relief. We spend so much time and energy curating our earthly mansions, our homes, our bank accounts, our status, our comfort, things which are literally crumbling lodges in a cucumber patch.
And we spend so little energy investing in the mansion that lasts forever.
It is a devastating critique of worldliness.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Edwards' many mansions, let's summarize the key takeaways for the listener. First, heaven is a prepared place for a prepared people. It is a real structure. It is a temple, a palace, and a home.
Second, the doctrine offers both deep comfort and strong motivation. Comfort, because there is room for all who come to Christ, no matter their background or past sins. Motivation, because there are degrees of reward, and our life of obedience here genuinely matters for our life there.
And finally, the sheer urgency of it all. The example of the father and son in Northampton brings to mind that we do not know when our lease on this house of clay is up. Securing a mansion in the Father's house is the only rational priority for a human being.
It really is. Edward strips away all the cultural excuses. He leaves you with the bare reality of your immortal soul before a holy God.
Well, here is a final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your week. Edwards makes that chilling observation that one can be exalted to heaven simply by sitting in a church pew, yet still be in danger of the deepest hell. It forces us to ask ourselves, is my seat in the church a true sign of my salvation, or is it just a temporary spot I am occupying before the final judgment? Are we true citizens of the household, or are we just guests lingering in the lobby?
That is the question that matters most.
Thank you for joining us on Reform Thinking. We hope this discussion of Jonathan Edwards has been as challenging and encouraging to you as it has been to us. Until next time, keep thinking and keep looking up.